You were never weak. You were just predictable. They didn't break you because you were powerless. They broke you because you were visible. You wore your heart like a badge of honor, believing that if you showed your pain, the world would pause, would care. You thought vulnerability meant connection, that honesty would invite protection, that if you bled openly, someone would finally stop the bleeding. But here's the brutal truth. The world doesn't protect what it can read. It weaponizes it. You see, vulnerability when exposed to the wrong audience isn't a bridge. It's bait. They study your pain like a manual. They learn where it hurts, not to heal it, but to use it. Not because they're monsters, but because pain is leverage, and leverage is power. You thought by revealing your fears you were showing courage, but all they saw was opportunity. They didn't hear your cry for connection. They heard a weakness they could press on. And every time you explained yourself, softened your tone, or offered your truth, you gave them the blueprint for how to control you, because that's what most people won't admit. Vulnerability in the wrong hands is not intimacy, it's a liability. It becomes a soft underbelly exposed in a battlefield that rewards armor, not openness. The most dangerous lie they taught you was this: that to be loved you had to be soft, that to be accepted you had to be readable, that to be strong you had to be honest, even if it cost you everything. So you told yourself, if I'm just more understanding, if I just explain it better, if I stay a little longer, give a little more, then maybe, just maybe, they'll love me right. But love doesn't arrive through explanation, and respect never comes when you're too easy to access. You didn't lose people because you lacked worth. You lost them because they stopped fearing the consequences of losing you. And once they learn how to push your emotional buttons, they don't stop. They test, they poke, they watch, not to understand you, but to see how much more they can get before you break. Your emotions became a roadmap. Your reactions became a mirror for their power. And your openness, that rare, sacred thing, became their method of control. This is why you feel drained, why your kindness starts to feel like a burden, why your voice starts to tremble, not from fear, but from exhaustion. You're not weak. You're just exposed. You've handed out every key to your inner world, and now you wonder why everyone keeps walking in like they own the place. So what's the way out? You stop giving away your weapon. Your pain is no longer public property. Your fears are no longer invitations. Your truth is no longer for sale to anyone who hasn't earned it, because the world doesn't change. But you can. And it begins when you stop explaining and start observing. When you stop bleeding for people who keep sharpening the knife. When you stop believing that being accessible is the same as being loved. Power begins in silence. Respect is built in restraint. And safety is not found in being understood. It's found in being unreadable. So keep your truth. Hold your emotions close. Not because you're ashamed, but because you finally understand the cost of exposure. They don't get to study you anymore. From now on, they don't see pain. They feel presence. They don't hear explanations. They sense distance. They don't get answers. They get silence. Because you've learned the lesson the hard way. They didn't hurt you because you were honest. They hurt you because you were transparent. And now you vanish from their reach. Not to hide, but to reclaim what they never deserved in the first place. Your pain was never meant to be a performance. You didn't survive all that pain just to turn it into a spectacle. But somewhere along the way, they trained you to bleed like it was theater. They told you that if you opened up, they'd care. That if you were honest, they'd protect you. That if you exposed the broken pieces inside you, someone would finally choose to stay. But no one stayed. No one saved you. Because the world doesn't run on empathy. It runs on advantage. Every time you cracked yourself open for someone to see the real you, you unknowingly taught them how to hurt you more effectively next time. They didn't bring bandages. They brought knives. Not because you deserved it, but because performance invites consumption. They made you believe your pain was your personality, that your suffering somehow made you special. And in trying to be understood, you became predictable. In trying to be loved, you became readable. And what's readable is always controllable. That's the secret no one tells you. When your pain is on display, it stops being sacred. It becomes strategy for them, not for you. You wanted healing, but they gave you attention. You wanted connection, but they gave you control. Because every time you cried in front of people who never earned your trust, you handed them the manual on how to break you again. And the worst part, you let them back in. You stitched your wounds in the dark. You grew stronger in silence. But the moment they returned with soft words and empty apologies, you reopened yourself like a door that never learned to lock. And for what closure validation proof that your pain meant something to someone, but pain doesn't prove your worth. And suffering doesn't make you noble. You weren't healing, you were hoping. And hope in the hands of the wrong people becomes a trap. Because the truth is, they won't stop hurting you until you stop offering yourself as an open wound. This is your turning point. Not when you numb the pain, but when you harden it. When you stop telling stories about what broke you and start building something from the wreckage. Because that pain, it wasn't given to make you weak. It was given to sharpen you, to teach you how to protect what matters, to stop bleeding in public for people who only gather to watch. You've cried enough. You've begged enough. You've hoped long enough. Now you disappear. Not in sadness, but in strategy. You cut the access. You close the show. No more leaking pain into conversations. No more justifying why you're distant. No more apologizing for your healing taking a shape they don't recognize. Because your pain is no longer a performance. It's your armor. Your silence is no longer a void. It's your sanctuary. Your distance is no longer punishment. It's your protection. And if they think you've changed, they're right. Because you've finally learned that not every pain deserves to be shared. Some pain is sacred. Some pain is yours alone. And some pain becomes the fire that forges you. So you walk away not wounded but warned, not bitter but built. You don't raise your voice. You raise your standards. You don't chase understanding. You demand peace. Let them call you cold. Let them call you distant. Let them call you hard. Because what you've become is untouchable. Not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped performing. The most powerful voice in the room doesn't speak. It's felt in a world addicted to noise. The most powerful presence is the one that doesn't beg to be heard. You used to think that if you spoke clearly, they'd understand. If you explained enough, they'd respect you. If you stayed visible, available, open, someone would finally choose you. But the truth is far colder. People don't value what's familiar. They value what they can't predict. You were taught to be accessible, to be polite, to always answer the call, respond to the text, explain your silence, justify your boundaries. But the moment you became easy to reach, you became easy to dismiss. Here's the brutal reality. When you're always available, they stop listening. When you stop speaking, they start paying attention. Your presence was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be undeniable. The truly powerful don't announce themselves, they enter with gravity. They don't dominate with volume, they dominate with stillness. And silence, when used with discipline, is louder than any scream. You don't need to chase approval. You don't need to clarify your intentions. You don't need to broadcast your pain or narrate your process. Because the moment they can anticipate your every move, they stop respecting your presence. Mystery is magnetic. Scarcity creates value. And silence, real, intentional, strategic silence, makes the room adjust to you without a single word. It's not about being cold. It's about being calculated. The ones who command the most respect don't fill space, they redefine it. They pause before they speak. They choose their words like a weapon. They make others lean in wonder, reflect. You used to overshare because you thought openness built connection. But connection built on overexposure is always conditional. It lasts only as long as you perform it. And you're done performing. Now you move differently. You speak when your voice carries consequence, not just comfort. You show up when it matters, not when they expect. You leave before they get too comfortable with your presence. Because you've realized something life-changing. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You just need to be missed when you're gone. That's the shift. That's the edge. That's the art of presence without exposure. Let others post every thought, narrate every feeling, explain every decision. Let them dilute their worth with noise. You become the echo that lingers when the talking stops. You don't interrupt, you disrupt. Not with chaos, but with calm. Not with argument, but with absence. And in that absence, you teach them what your presence was worth. Because here's the Machiavellian truth. Power isn't in being understood. Power is in being impossible to ignore. The person who controls the tension in a room controls the outcome. You used to fill the silence because you feared being forgotten. But now, you leave space and they chase what's no longer guaranteed. They wonder what you're thinking. They replay the last thing you said. They feel the pressure of everything you didn't say. That's presence. You don't demand attention, you command it. Not with performance, but with posture. Not with noise, but with energy that says, I don't chase, I don't explain, I decide. From this moment forward, you stop narrating your pain. You stop giving real-time access to your thoughts, your heart, your mind. Not because you've shut down, but because you've leveled up. Now you use silence like a blade. Now you arrive like a storm calm, controlled and undeniable. Now you don't just enter the room, you become the weight they can't ignore. Emotional control isn't suppression. It's strategy. They want you emotional, not because they care, but because emotion is predictable. And what they can predict, they can control. You think they're testing your love. They're testing your reaction. They want to know, how fast do you flinch? How easily do you defend yourself? How deep do your wounds still bleed? Because the more reactive you are, the easier you are to steer. The more visible your emotions, the more vulnerable your power becomes. Let's be clear. Emotions are not weakness, but undisciplined emotions are. You've been taught to feel everything out loud, to cry it out, talk it through, react in real time like it proves you're human. But real power doesn't panic. It doesn't perform. It waits. You don't win power by reacting, you win it by pausing. Emotional control isn't about becoming numb. It's about holding fire without burning the room down. It's the ability to look directly at chaos and remain unmoved, to hear the insult, see the betrayal, feel the sting, and not flinch. Because when they can't move you emotionally, they can't manipulate you psychologically. The moment you become unshakable, you become unplayable. This is the quiet advantage Machiavelli understood long before the world had words like emotional intelligence. He knew the king who reacts first loses. The ruler who lashes out is the one who gets dethroned. When you respond with calculated silence instead of uncontrolled emotion, you shift from being a player to becoming the board. Let them talk. Let them provoke. Let them wonder why you're not responding the way they expected, why your face doesn't twitch, why your voice doesn't rise, why your soul stays still like deep water, because deep water doesn't splash. It pulls you under. They want to see you explode, because an explosion is loud, chaotic, and temporary, but your stillness, your silence, that's what haunts them. It leaves them alone with their reflection, their games, their guilt, and no weapon left to use. Because their power only worked when you handed them your buttons to push. You used to argue, to explain, to defend your worth like a lawyer in court. But now you speak only when your words can cut like a blade, not to harm, but to end the conversation with finality. That's the shift. You don't prove anymore. You position. You take the space between provocation and response, and you make it a fortress. And that's where you win. That gap is your advantage. That pause, it's not hesitation. It's calculation. It's not that you don't feel, you just no longer show it to those who haven't earned access. Because your emotions are no longer for public display. They are no longer currency for cheap intimacy. They are intelligence, information, fuel. You save it, you study it, and you use it when it serves you. So the next time they try to drag you into a game of emotional chess, you don't play. You watch. You wait. You disappear when expected to explode. You whisper when they expect a roar. And that's when they realize you are no longer reactive. You are radioactive, still, silent, dangerous. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming clear. Your peace is no longer performative. It's weaponized. Because emotional control isn't just a trait. It's a superpower. The rarest kind. The kind that doesn't get tested because it's too dangerous to challenge. Boundaries aren't cruel. They're protection. You weren't broken because you felt too much. You were broken because you never learned how to protect what you felt. You gave access like it was love. You opened your door just because someone knocked. You believed that kindness meant saying yes, that love meant saying nothing, and that staying available meant being valued. But what happened? They took more. They asked for more. They gave less. And the moment you tried to set a boundary, they looked at you like you were the problem. Here's the truth no one teaches you. Every time you excuse disrespect, you authorize it. Not in words, in energy. And energy doesn't lie. You can say I'm strong, but if your actions say I'll tolerate anything just to keep you close, they'll believe your actions. You can say I deserve better, but if you let them cross the line again and again, they'll believe you don't even see the line yourself. Because people don't respect your heart. They respect your limits. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are filters. They separate the ones who are safe from the ones who are opportunistic. And the ones who get angry when you say no, they're the ones who benefited from you not having boundaries in the first place. Let that sink in. They liked you more when you were easier to use, when you responded instantly, when you always forgave, when you let them explain away the disrespect, the silence, the excuses. But you weren't being kind. You were being accessible. You weren't being forgiving. You were being conditioned. Conditioned to tolerate emotional poverty. Conditioned to explain your standards as if they needed approval. Conditioned to accept crumbs and call it connection. And now you're waking up. You're seeing the pattern. The way they only showed up when they needed something. The way your silence was mistaken for surrender. The way your love was taken as access, not a gift. So now you draw the line. Not out of revenge, not from anger, but from clarity. Clarity that says, my peace is not a place for your chaos. Clarity that says love without respect is not love, it's control. Clarity that says, if you cannot honor my boundaries, you don't get to access me at all. It's not about closing your heart. It's about closing the doors that lead to it. Because you've learned that the most dangerous people are not the loud ones. They're the ones who pretend to care while they quietly drain you. So you stop explaining why you need space. You stop negotiating your standards. You stop waiting for someone to validate your no. You don't owe anyone comfort at the cost of your mental health. You don't owe anyone the version of you that doesn't say enough. And when they call you cold, now let them. Because warmth without boundaries turns into self-destruction. Because love without limits becomes leverage against you. Let them be uncomfortable with the new you. Let them complain that you've changed. Because you have, and that's the point. This new version of you doesn't bleed for attention, doesn't chase closure, doesn't flinch when questioned. This version of you holds the line, without apology, without explanation. Because boundaries are not selfish, they are sacred. They are the walls of your emotional kingdom. And if someone refuses to respect those walls, they were never meant to be inside them. So build the gate, close the door, and raise the standard. From now on, your energy isn't free. Your time isn't open for negotiation. Your space is earned, not assumed. And if that makes you harder to reach, then good. Because the right people won't be offended by your boundaries. They'll be grateful for them. You weren't born to bleed. You were trained to be silent. You didn't come into this world fragile. You were made that way slowly, systematically, subtly. Not by enemies, but by people who told you that your softness was your strength, that your kindness would be rewarded, that if you just loved hard enough, stayed long enough, gave enough, eventually they'd see your worth. But they didn't. They saw your silence as surrender, your forgiveness as permission, your availability as access. And they didn't protect your open heart, they used it as a map to break you. You weren't weak. You were just trained to be manageable, taught to be likable instead of powerful, taught to be agreeable instead of respected, taught that to be a good person you had to endure quietly. They told you being the bigger person meant swallowing your voice. That love meant bending until you cracked. That maturity meant tolerating what should have been walked away from. And you believed them because no one ever told you the truth. You were being conditioned to serve a system that feeds on your silence. Every time you stayed quiet to keep the peace, you taught people they could disrespect you without consequence. Every time you smiled through pain, they learned your comfort was less important than their convenience. Every time you softened your edges to stay lovable, you became easier to leave. You were told vulnerability was beautiful, and it is. But no one taught you that it must be protected, that not everyone deserves access to your rawness, that bleeding in front of people who sharpen knives is not bravery, it's slow destruction. You kept giving, and they kept taking, and instead of waking up, you blamed yourself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I should have explained more. Maybe they'll change next time, but they didn't, because you were never the problem. Your training was. You were taught to mistake loyalty for survival, to confuse tolerance with love, to accept suffering as proof of your worth. But here's the truth. Being good in the wrong environment will always break you. So now you unlearn, you untrain. You stop apologizing for your standards. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop shrinking to stay digestible. Because the real you, the powerful you, is not soft on command. The real you isn't here to be liked. The real you isn't here to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You weren't meant to be emotionally available to everyone. You were meant to be sovereign. You start remembering what they tried to erase, that your voice matters, that your absence has weight, that your truth doesn't need a round of applause to be real. They'll say you've changed. And they're right. You've stopped being the version of yourself that begged for crumbs and started becoming the version that walks away from the whole table. You no longer seek approval from systems built to exploit your empathy. You no longer stay in rooms that require your silence to feel accepted. You no longer sacrifice your peace just to be chosen. Because now you see it clearly, they didn't break you out of hate. They broke you because you were trained to let them. But that training ends here. This is your psychological reset. You don't raise your voice, you raise your standard. You don't beg for clarity. Your absence becomes the message. You don't wait to be respected. You move in a way that makes disrespect feel dangerous. You've been broken. You've been ignored. You've been used. But now you're rebuilding strategically, ruthlessly, quietly. You've stopped asking to be seen because you've seen yourself. And now that you've seen your worth, no one gets to write over it again. You're not becoming heartless. You're becoming untouchable. When love fades, only fear holds the line. They taught you to lead with love, to speak gently, to be kind, to be open. They said, if you just love hard enough, give long enough, endure quietly enough, people would finally treat you right. But they didn't. They didn't treat you better when you became softer. They didn't respect you more when you forgave quicker. They didn't stop crossing lines just because you loved them past the pain. They crossed more because love, beautiful, powerful, essential, is fragile. It fluctuates. It forgets. It assumes. And when there are no consequences, even the people who claim to love you will test your limits. Here's the harsh truth. No one wants to admit. People are rarely loyal to your heart. They are loyal to your leverage. You thought your kindness would keep them close, but it only made them comfortable. And comfort kills boundaries. When someone is too sure they'll always have access to you, they stop guarding their behavior. They stop filtering their tone. They stop respecting your time, your peace, your silence. Not because they hate you, but because they no longer fear losing you. And that's the line Machiavelli drew with brutal clarity over 500 years ago. It is much safer to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. Fear isn't cruelty, it's consequence. Love asks for respect. Fear enforces it. When someone fears disappointing you, they pause before they speak. They think twice before they take. They measure their actions not because you yelled, but because your absence has weight. You don't need to scream to earn fear. You don't need to threaten or rage. You just need to move with finality. That's what commands people's behavior, not your empathy, but the energy you carry when you've stopped asking to be treated well and started expecting it. Because love without fear becomes indulgence. It becomes comfort without consequence. It becomes a game of how far can I go before they break. You've seen it. You gave more than you had. You stayed longer than you should. You offered chance after chance, apology after apology. And what happened? They didn't stop hurting you. They stopped hiding it. Because they knew you'd forgive. Because they knew you'd explain it away. Because they knew your love had no edge, just endless access. And that's not love. That's vulnerability without boundaries. And in a world where people chase power more than peace, it's a dangerous place to live. So now you shift. You stop being easy to read. You stop repeating yourself. You stop over-explaining the lines they keep crossing. You make your distance speak. You let your silence burn louder than any confrontation. And if they don't feel your absence, they were never meant to have your presence in the first place. Because power doesn't beg to be treated well, it makes mistreatment too costly. You don't get walked over because you're kind. You get walked over because your kindness comes with no consequence. You don't get used because you're loving. You get used because your love is unconditional even when it's not respected. That ends now. You don't stop loving, you love with terms. You don't stop caring, you care selectively. You don't stop being good, but you stop being available to everyone. Because from now on you understand something vital. Fear keeps people cautious. Love keeps people close. But only the right balance keeps people honorable. So let them feel the shift. Let them miss the access. Let them regret the comfort they once mistook for permanence. You didn't lose your light. You just stopped handing it to people who wanted to bask in it without protecting its flame. You don't need to raise your voice. You just need to raise your cost. And once you do, they'll either rise to meet your standard or disappear when they realize they never intended to. That's not bitterness. That's strategy. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. And that's how you stop being a lesson they never learn from and become the boundary they never forget. You weren't broken. You were systematically trained to betray yourself. You didn't just wake up one day weak, you were sculpted into it, not by accident, but by design. From childhood, from school, from every relationship that demanded silence over truth, you were fed a formula that rewarded compliance and punished clarity. Be nice. Stay quiet. Don't be too much. Don't make them uncomfortable. And little by little, you learn to abandon yourself in exchange for acceptance. They told you to express your truth, but never showed you how to protect it. They praised your honesty until your honesty disrupted their control. They told you to love unconditionally, but only if it meant staying soft, staying small, staying predictable. And so, like most, you adapted. You internalized the sickness of a broken system and called it personality. You became polite at the cost of your peace. You became loyal at the cost of your sanity. You became emotionally available in environments that only studied your feelings to use them. Every space you entered, family, work, friendships, love, was silently governed by power structures. And in each one, your emotional openness didn't elevate you. It made you a target. Because here's the hard truth. The world doesn't reward vulnerability. It exploits it, especially when it's given freely. Every time you over-explained your intentions, they heard insecurity. Every time you overshared your fears, they saw an opportunity to push. Every time you apologized for existing too boldly, they learned how to dim your light just enough to keep control. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility now. Because this system isn't going to stop. It profits off your performance. It thrives when you doubt yourself. It wins every time you hesitate to protect your soul out of fear of being too much. But now you see it. You see the programming. You see the silent conditioning that told you being broken was noble as long as it kept others comfortable. That's not kindness. That's captivity. So now the cycle must break. You stop giving explanations to people who never intended to understand you. You stop narrating your pain to those who only want to study your weakness. You stop handing over your peace to systems that were built to fracture it. You were never too emotional. You were just emotional in places that fed off your sensitivity without ever feeding you back. From this moment forward, your openness is earned, not assumed. Your empathy is filtered, not automatic. Your kindness is protected, not offered as bait. Because you are no longer a product of their programming. You are no longer a reflection of the wounds they trained you to ignore. You are not a mirror for their approval. You are not a blueprint for their manipulation. You are the interruption. The cycle ends with you not in rebellion but in reconstruction. You rebuild the version of you that doesn't chase closure. You rebuild the version that doesn't wait for permission to be respected. You rebuild the version that remembers who you were before they taught you to shrink. They will say you've changed. They will say you've become distant, colder, guarded. But that's not coldness. That's self-respect in motion. That's what it looks like when someone stops betraying themselves just to keep others comfortable. You are no longer easy to read, no longer easy to reach, no longer predictable. And when they ask what happened to you, you won't need to answer. Because now your boundaries speak. Your silence defines. Your energy makes decisions long before your mouth opens. You are not cruel. You are clear. You are not angry. You are awake. And the system that once shaped you will never shape you again. Stop waiting for closure. Become it. You keep waiting for the apology, for the text that explains everything, for the moment they finally say, "I understand what I did to you." You replay conversations in your head, reread the last message, analyze every silence like it holds the answer. But it never comes. And deep down, you already know why. Because the ones who hurt you don't want to fix the wound. They just don't want to be blamed for it. They walked away without looking back because accountability was never their plan. They ghosted you, gaslit you, blamed your reaction, and then waited to see if you'd break. And you did, but not in the way they expected. You shattered quietly, alone, hoping that maybe if you stayed open, stayed available, stayed patient, they'd return with clarity. But they never do, because people who thrive in confusion will never hand you clarity. They know that if you have closure, you'll walk away. So they keep the door cracked, just enough for you to wonder, to hope, to hurt. That's how they keep you in orbit around an absence. But here's the truth. No one tells you closure is not a gift you wait for. It's a boundary you build. It's a decision made in silence. Not because you're okay, but because you're done waiting to be okay. Closure doesn't arrive in a well-worded apology. It arrives the moment you realize you were chasing peace from people who profit off your unrest. You don't need them to say sorry. You need to walk away before your soul forgets what stillness feels like. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. Someone who heard your pain and used it for leverage. Someone who studied your kindness and stretched it until it tore. You don't heal by staying in emotional negotiations with people who've already left the table. You heal when you stop begging the architect of the wound to also be the one who stitches it closed. So instead of texting one more time, disappear. Instead of asking what went wrong, decide it already did. You create closure through absence, not conversation, through stillness, not explanation, through presence that no longer bends itself around their patterns. Because the moment you stop performing pain for an audience that's already moved on, you reclaim the stage. And they will feel that silence. Not immediately, but eventually. They will feel the space you used to fill, the energy you used to pour, the loyalty they assumed would always be there. And when they do, they won't remember what you said. They'll remember what your absence made them realize. That's the power you forgot you had. You thought closure was a conversation, but it was always your choice. You don't close the door with words. You close it with standards, with quiet distance, with a calm that says, "I no longer break here." And when you move like that, you stop being an open chapter in their story. you become the end of it. They will scroll back, reread the last thing you said, wonder if they pushed too far, replay your silence like a song they didn't know they loved until it stopped playing. But it won't matter, because by then you'll be gone. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, energetically. And that's what real closure feels like. Not the final word, but the final withdrawal of your energy. You don't need revenge. You don't need one last conversation. You don't even need to be understood. You need only one thing: to never hand your power back to the very person who taught you to doubt it. So let them wonder. Let them scroll. Let them sit with the echo of everything they never got to hear. Because from this point forward, you're not waiting for healing. You are the healing. And your absence is the chapter that never gets rewritten. You don't have to prove you've changed. They'll feel it. There comes a moment when something in you doesn't break, it hardens. Not into bitterness, but into clarity. Not into hate, but into distance. The kind of distance that doesn't beg to be noticed, because it commands attention without saying a word. You used to explain yourself, to justify your silence, to soften your tone so others wouldn't feel small in your presence. You bent your light so they could stand in your shadow without discomfort. But where did that get you overlooked, taken for granted, misunderstood by people who never had the depth to meet you in the places you were bleeding? You were told, speak your truth, but no one told you that truth without protection is ammunition in the wrong hands. You kept talking, hoping they'd finally listen. But what they did was study. They studied your fears, your doubts, your dreams, not to understand you, but to use you. Now you don't explain your boundaries. You enforce them. You don't announce the distance. You become it. You don't whisper warnings anymore. Your absence is the only lesson they'll ever need. You used to think power came from proving, but power never needed a microphone. It never had to yell. It entered the room and everything shifted, because now you understand something they never wanted you to learn. Real presence speaks louder than performance. And real power doesn't ask, it asserts. You don't flinch when tested. You don't chase when misunderstood. You don't correct every rumor or rush to fix every misinterpretation. You let silence wrap around you like armor. Because silence doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means no one's earned the right to hear it. They'll say you've changed. You have. You've stopped negotiating your worth with people who only offered confusion in return. You've stopped leaking energy into places that only wanted to drain you. You've stopped walking into rooms wondering if you belong. Because now you decide if the room deserves your presence. And presence, real presence, isn't volume. It's vibration. It's the way people lower their voice when you enter. The way they second-guess their words. The way they feel your silence pressing against their noise. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You don't need to return to show them what they lost, because they'll feel it. Not when you're there, but in the echo of your absence. The texts you don't answer, the calls you don't return, the invitation you never needed to decline, because silence already spoke for you. This version of you, it doesn't scream. It settles. It's calm, not because there's no fire, but because the fire no longer burns without purpose. They can't reach you, not because you're hiding, but because you've risen. You're no longer standing in the middle of chaos trying to prove your worth to people who prefer you broken. You're walking out measured, deliberate, unreadable. Because now you've learned you don't need to be seen. You need to be respected. You don't need validation. You need boundaries that don't move for anyone. Let them wonder. Let them replay every last thing you said. Let them sit in the stillness you left behind, because you've stopped being their lesson. You've become the line they can't cross again. This isn't numbness. This is strategy. This isn't bitterness. This is rebirth. This isn't distance for attention. It's distance for protection. You are not cold. You are calculated. You are not unreachable. You are untouchable. And from this moment forward, you don't explain change. You radiate it. Life isn't about being understood. It's about being untouchable. One of the most powerful truths in life is this: people don't always value your kindness. They value your boundaries. You were taught to express your heart, to explain your feelings, to stay open no matter what. But the harsh reality is that openness without discernment doesn't lead to connection. It leads to manipulation. Not everyone deserves access to your truth. Not everyone is capable of holding your vulnerability with care. And when you constantly over-explain, overgive, and overstay, you don't look strong, you look readable. And what's readable becomes predictable. And what's predictable becomes controllable. The lesson is simple but not easy. You must unlearn the habits that kept you soft for people who only needed you weak. You don't need to scream to be powerful. You don't need to prove your worth to people who benefit from your doubt. The strongest presence in the room is often the quietest one, the person who speaks only when it matters and who walks away without apology. In relationships, in work, in every space you enter, you teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. And tolerance without standards becomes self-abandonment. So set boundaries like stone. Use silence as a filter. Respect your own emotional energy as if it were currency, because it is. Stop bleeding in front of people who only sharpen the blade. And remember, you don't need closure from them. You become the closure. You don't demand respect. You become the consequence. That's not cold. That's clarity. And clarity is what makes you untouchable.